Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 54th lecture of the lecture series. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars in humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of academic study of Indian languages and literatures envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. Later in 2005, a new department was established which still continues to carry research in Indian languages. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 took inspiration from this history and it is a platform for sharing research interests and ideas. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Your remarkable skills will be a great addition to our team. We will look forward to a mutually beneficial relationship with you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us today. Our lecturer of the day is Professor Indranil Acharya. He is a professor of English at Vidyasagar University. Sir will be talking on indigenous literatures of Australia and India. Uh, I will now hand over the mic to Purva. She will introduce our professor.
Welcome to Calcutta Comparatists 1919. In today's session, we'll listen to Professor Indranil Acharya, who is a professor at the Department of English with the Vidyasagar University, Midnapur, West Bengal. He has been an alumnus of University of Calcutta. The title of his PhD thesis is The Problematics of Identity in the Poetry of Yeats and Eliot. Professor Acharya has been the visiting professor at the Department of English, Delhi University. He has completed UGC Innovative Research Project, Colonial to Post-Colonial, revisiting the cultural cartographies of Adivashi communities in West Bengal. He was the principal investigator of UGC Major Research Project entitled Documentation, Translation and Analysis of Bengali Folk Drama in the Context of Endangerment. He has completed one UGC MRP entitled Black Words White Page, a historical and critical survey of contemporary Aboriginal fiction of Australia. He was the deputy coordinator in the UGC project on documentation and translation of Dalit and tribal literature in West Bengal. Professor Acharya has received an award, Excellence in Book Production to Paschim Bangir Bhasha, second prize in 2017. He has also got Excellence in Book Production to Sriti Biloper Pore, second prize in the regional language category awarded by Federation of Indian Publishers, New Delhi in 2018. He has received PLSI felicitation by Bhasha Research and Publication Center in 2017. Professor Acharya is a prolific translator and critic. He is the editor of Janajati Darpan. He edited and co-edited various books like Survival and Other Stories, Bangladesh Fiction in Translation, Towards Social Change, Essays on Dalit Literature. His research articles have widely been appeared in reputed academic journals and as chapters in books. He has been invited to numerous conferences in India. His teaching and research interests revolve around literature of the marginalized in translation, tribal culture, documentation, translation, and analysis of endangered folk drama of West Bengal, folklore studies, 18th century literature, Victorian poetry, modern poetry, literary criticism, Australian literature, Indian writing in English translation, Dalit literature, and others. The title of his talk today is Indigenous Literatures of Australia and India, a Comparatist Perspective. It's my pleasure to introduce you, sir. Uh, you may start your lecture. The floor is yours. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Purvasha, for your very kind introduction. In fact, it's my privilege to address this gathering today, this lecture series, which has been organized by Calcutta Comparatists 1919. It's a very old body of research scholars, and it has a great legacy of including many research luminaries in the past. And as an alumnus of the University of Calcutta, it's also my proud privilege to return to such a platform and to be able to share my research interests with you. And really, I'm thankful to you because we get an opportunity to talk about the minority languages, literatures, and culture in a platform particularly associated with a university that had been, in a way, a strong, bastion of mainstream British and American literature. In fact, a university which had, held on to the canonical mainstream literary conventions, even at the beginning of the 21st century. And I'm very happy to be present here today to witness the change, the transition, which has gradually taken place in the university ecosystem. And I'm really very happy to find how the other issues, the emerging research interests in the global context are gradually being embraced by the researchers and all concerned people in the University of Calcutta ecosystem. And in a way, I'm really thankful to Calcutta Comparatists 1919 for organizing such a lecture on such an area, a relatively less paid attention, an area which had been relatively ignored over the last many decades. Anyway, I would like to go directly to the topic of my lecture. And really, I would take just a few seconds to offer my gratitude to Protein because he had been instrumental in making this lecture possible. He had been in constant touch with me, and Protein had been so insistent, and he had been so eager to have me in this forum as a speaker that I could not ignore his repeated requests. So thank you, Pratim, for making this happen this time. And as you know from the title of my lecture, Indigenous Literatures of Australia and India, a Comparatist Perspective, I have added another phrase in the context of endangerment because you know that indigenous languages, literatures, and cultures are globally endangered, and that's the reason why the United Nations had declared 2019 as the year of indigenous languages of the world. And it had attached great significance to the conservation, documentation, and promotion of indigenous languages, literatures, and cultures over the last one decade. And if you look at the history of the universal declaration of human rights, in fact, if you look at the United Nations initiatives in the field of the preservation of indigenous human rights, you would find that there had been paradigmatic shifts in the field, taking into consideration the consistent attempt on the part of the first world academic intellectuals, researchers, policymakers, academic administrators to pay special attention to the issue of the re-establishment and reassertion of the indigenous voices, the re-establishment of indigenous human rights. In fact, if I look into my own research career, I find that I was first inspired by the emerging area of Australian Aboriginal literature. When I came across, many interesting newspaper reports, say published in the Statesman, the Telegraph, and other leading dailies, say at the beginning of the 21st century, when I had been doing my doctoral research. It was in a different field, and on the on the poetry of Yeats and Eliot, but the problematics of identity, particularly with regard to T.S. Eliot, led me to a new kind of discovery, where I found that Eliot had a keen interest in anthropological issues. And he also had a great interest in the African tribes, and he was particularly interested in the Amazonian tribes of Brazil. And there are a few references. There are also a few private correspondences which we find in the collected letters of T.S. Eliot, where there had been many explicit references to the tribal situation, to the tribal identity, especially in the Amazon area. So Eliot's anthropological engagement had also been amply illustrated in his magnum opus, the Westland, where you find how the ideas, anthropological concepts, which we find firmly embedded in the Golden Bough of Sir James Fraser, and also in that seminal text From Ritual to Romance by J.C. Weston, had been amply illustrated in the introduction of the figure of Tiresias, and also the other, ancient mythical situations which had a kind of contemporaneity in present history. So Eliot's mythical method itself, speaks volumes of the anthropological engagement which he had during the making of his poetical work. So that led me to look into other anthropological situations in other continents. And as I've already mentioned, that many newspaper reports, say around 2001 2002, at that point of time, say up to 2004, gave me an idea that the Australian Aboriginal situation had been of a great interest in the global indigenous research circle. In fact, I came to know how the new Aboriginal authors, particularly the women authors of Australia, had already hogged the limelight to a major extent, and how their fictional works, particularly their novels, had been a great favorite with the major Australian publishing houses, and how it cuts across the racial divide, and how it had a great appeal to the non-Aboriginal Australians too. So all these insights also created another curiosity in me. Particularly, I can remember one report published in the Statesman, say in 2004, where it was categorically mentioned that the title of that report was race, that biologically means nothing. So when I read that report, when I delved deep into that report, I found that there the writer had in a way discussed some contemporary researches into the biological significance of the concept of race, and ultimately, it turned out to be nothing. In a way, a very unscientific notion. And what happened that we also found in that report that in fact all these constructs, racial construct of black and white, had been sociologically determined, and it has a great element of cultural politics, and it was also part of the colonialist discourse. To perpetuate the racial divide, to promote the notion of apartheid, so that this divide could continue, and the hegemonic discourse could prevail. So in a way, I found many such interesting insights from the contemporary reports. But one very striking revelation was that the Australian Aborigines, whom we see in various parts of Australia and also in the Torres Strait Islands, had been in a way had been the successors of the Austric tribes of the Chotanagpur Plateau. in the Indian subcontinent, in the Indian peninsula, particularly. And there is the theory of the tectonic movement. It's a geographic theory whereby the land mass, the vast land masses began to move. And along with that, many tribal communities drifted away from the Indian peninsula, and many of them reached the Australian shore. And that was the migration. That was the history of migration of many of the ostrich tribes, from the Indian peninsula to the Australian continent. So that is a very interesting insight, very interesting finding. And that's why, in a way, when we categorize the Chotanagpur tribes of central India or eastern India, we describe them as Austroasiatic. This Austroasiatic, once again, has a connection, with Australia. And there we find how the DNA similarities have also been established to a large extent, and how there had been many common cultural traits, and also other kinds of similarities had been explored in course of scientific research. So that created my interest, that ignited my interest, rather, my curiosity in the area. And I began my first minor research project in this area, where I attempted to document the fictional works of the contemporary Australian Aboriginal authors. And in course of that, I also came across the entire history of the Aboriginal settlement in the Australian subcontinent. And also I found that how they reached the shore first, how they settled in different locations. And I also found the white settlement in Australia in 1788, and what were the fallouts of this first invasion by the white men, and the prolonged history of the men and the Aborigines conflict. And in a way, I also came to know about the rich over of the Aboriginal orality, okay, the different kinds of folkloric tradition, and how orature was largely ignored by the Eurocentric notion of academia of knowledge, and how this knowledge system was deliberately excluded from serious academic engagement. And later, gradually, along with many seminal attempts, okay, the whole tradition of Australian Aboriginal oral literature gradually found its place in the mainstream through translation, particularly through translation. And how we find how an entirely new generation of Australian Aboriginal writers came up, who were schooled in missionary institutions, and how there had been a change in their outlook, in their worldview, and how they represented their culture after being assimilated into an alien culture, and what were the pangs and sufferings of dual identity, and how there was a continual shifting between a sense of belonging, unbelonging, and maybe a transcendence of belonging. So all such issues were studied in some detail by me during my first research project, which I completed in my university. And after the completion of that project, it was early 2008. Now I thought of once again expanding the domain of research, because as I had that kind of hindsight, where I had the knowledge that these Austroasiatic tribes of the eastern and central parts of the Indian subcontinent. And the Australian Aboriginal communities had many similarities. In fact, they had, genetic, biological, historical, cultural, affinities, resonances, and many kinds of, other, engagements, common engagements. So I decided to expand the domain of my research, and in fact, we thought of, submitting a proposal to the UGC under the Special Assistance Program, Departmental Research Support Scheme. It was way back in 2008, and it was on the documentation, translation, and analysis of the oral and folk literature or literary traditions of the Dalit and tribal communities of West Bengal. Later, it was expanded to Eastern India. That was the beginning of a comparatist, framework, which we were attempting to create, okay, in order to understand the global indigenous situation vis-a-vis the Indian indigenous situation. Okay, and what happened that in course of our research in the university, which began in 2009, but we could find, many resonances. We could find, many kind of convergences. Okay, and many common, cultural situations, predicaments. Okay, and also the most important, concern was that of endangerment. Yes, because in the Australian Aboriginal context, it was definitely a concern about the vanishing cultures, the unwritten languages, vanishing unwritten languages, and the vanishing oral literary traditions, and particularly the vanishing Aboriginal cultures. And you know about the policies of assimilation that were pursued by the white Australian government over a substantial period of time. So that was the beginning of, our research, and we found that common thread, that was of endangerment, a common concern about the endangered cultures, languages, and literatures. And in course of our research, we identified many, indigenous communities, okay, in the Eastern Indian context, okay, which also had, its presence in the neighboring states and countries, because all these were, cross border, indigenous communities. So we found their footprints in other states and even outside India as well. So we came to understand, the real plight of, the real predicament of such, indigenous communities, their languages, their literatures, their cultures. Okay, and we could find that how, this worldview, this indigenous worldview, was conspicuous by its absence, in the context of the mainstream majoritarian, literary discourse. How they had been left out of the mainstream academia, over a long period of time, and how they remained invisible, culturally invisible, in the larger society as well. So with these few words, I would like to move on to my first slide. Just Yes. So, Indigenous Australians use many terms to refer to themselves, as especially the researchers on Indigenous literatures of Australia. Most use the term Aboriginal because of the shared history, and also the national political solidarity, because the white Australian government, preferred to describe them as Aboriginals, and that created a kind of political identity, national political identity, which was convenient to, in a way, associate, and which was convenient to unite and organize the indigenous communities from different parts of Australia. But this idea of Aboriginal was also objected because it was imposed by the British. Yes, it was part of the White Australia policy, and it obscures the diversity of indigenous cultures. Yes, in our own context, also in the Indian context as well, when we talk about the tribe, the notion of tribe, it doesn't capture the nuances which we find when we use an Indian word, an indigenous word, Adivasi. Okay, so when we compare the usage of the two terms, tribe and Adivasi, we are able to understand the cultural nuances, which clearly construct a multi-layered identity when we talk of Adivasi, and how it talks about the indigenous engagements with the issues of identity, with the perceptions of identity, and with the realizations of identity. So, diversity of indigenous cultures and can't distinguish from other parts of the world. That was a major point of dissent. And language groups and regional group identities preferred. In fact, Torres Strait Islanders prefer to describe them, with the help of their geographical identity, their cartographical presence, and language groups and regional group identities were preferred, and indigenous was the most neutral term, and it was accepted by almost all the communities. And in the next slide, I refer to one report published in The Guardian on 21st March 2014 about the stolen generations. There is a great national tragedy for the Aboriginal communities, and it was about the stolen generations, abduction of the Aboriginal children from their Aboriginal homes by the white Australian police. And it was the government policy, the white Australian government policy, to in a way ignore and delete completely the Aboriginal identity, to delete all traces, all associations of Aboriginal identity, and to create a new Australia, that would be a white Australia, and all the Aboriginal children of the new generation would be part of that white Australia. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were endangered. Okay, and the oral cultures were fast dying out. I have already mentioned that oral cultures, different forms of performance, the songs, okay, other rituals, many utterances, riddles, mantras. Okay, so there were many secret utterances which were quite part of private to the core identity of the indigenous people. Okay, were ignored, they were dying out. The embodied and emplaced form of knowledge, no, because the tattoos, the body paints, okay, were very much a kind of language, very much a symbolic language, and it was also part of a speech tradition. It was also part of an oral tradition, which was completely ignored by the Eurocentric notion of knowledge. So, and emplaced obviously the notion of the Boraring and other associated cultural concepts. Okay, completely, in a way, folklorize the place, the notion of space, and how place and folklore, how place and culture, how place and rituals became almost synonymous. So the threatened oral tradition to survive the learning generation, that is the young generation, the young Aboriginal people of Australia, should be in direct physical proximity to the teaching generation. Yes, that is the elderly people of the Aboriginal communities. Okay, so there should have been a physical proximity. Okay, but stolen generations, the white Australian policy of abducting the Aboriginal children from their homes, okay, but it blocked the possibilities of that direct physical proximity. Okay, and it created a distance, a separation between the learning generation and the teaching generation, and that spelled disaster for the survival of the oral tradition. and that aggravated the threatened status of the oral tradition in the Australian Aboriginal context. So it was the beginning of end when we find the arrival of the British at the Sydney Cove in 1788, how it brought death and displacement and severe cultural disruption to the Aborigines. If you read the Wildcat trilogy by the famous Australian Aboriginal novelist Mudruru, his Christian name is Colin Johnson. Okay, you will find a very moving account of this tragic history of death, displacement, and severe cultural disruption to the Aborigines. And the white landholders drove out Aborigines, missionaries banned traditional languages and ceremonies. Okay, so we find that there was a very piquant situation whereby we find how the intervention of Christian missionaries in a way decimated the prospects of the survival of Aboriginal traditional languages and ceremonies. Okay, and how they were denied any kind of land rights. Okay, so in the name of conversion, in the name of cultural assimilation, thousands of Australian Aborigines were forced to, in a way, forget their culture, their identity, their rituals, and their everything. And this crisis of indigenous knowledge system that we find here, it was destroyed by the British because the oral tradition was derecognized by them. Okay, and the graphic signifying systems like sand drawings, body skirts, paintings, or carvings as forms of folk writing, were largely ignored. Okay, they were ignored. Okay, as non-knowledge. The colonial system of knowledge formation, the colonial politics of knowledge production. You were aware of that. And as it happened in the Indian context as well, as it happened also with the Indian tribal cultural traditions. Okay, so similarly in the Australian Aboriginal situation, we find how these graphic signifying systems, of folk writing were completely ignored by the British, and the orality was considered as backward, primitive and ignorant. Okay, so secret domains of knowledge were not respected. Secret domains of knowledge. So the entire silent transfer of knowledge system from one generation to another, was in a way halted by the forcible abduction of the Aboriginal children uh, from their residences. So the problem arose when traditional oral regulative system gradually comes in contact with print and electronic communication technology. Yes. So this is the 20th century situation when we find that even the non-Aboriginal scholars, Australian scholars, gradually began to take interest in the Aboriginal culture, especially the oral culture, the oral regulative system. And there was the beginning of the process of documentation and archiving of the oral culture of the Aboriginal communities. So, but that created once again a problem because there was a conflict between the tradition and modernity. Technology changed the content and disrupted the customs. Okay, the introduced media. Okay, in a way, it changed the content. Okay, and it also, in a way, misrepresented to a certain extent. The customs. There was a disruption. Okay, because when it becomes, visible, when it becomes, absolutely, in a way, transparent, through technological transfer. What happens that the secret culture, the secret knowledge system, with its nuanced practices and beliefs, could not be, in a way, transferred. Could not be transferred. So there was a disruption in terms of the transfer of meaning, the transfer of signification. Okay, So the dialogic transactions were largely ignored. The non-verbal communication, okay, was excluded, and the performer audience dynamics was absent. This is very important. I have also noticed in the case of many of the indigenous folk performances of Bengal during one of my major research projects. Okay, I have found how in the very popular folk tradition of Palagan, okay, like Shitala Mongol, Shoshti Mongol, Chondi Mongol, Monosha Mongol, okay, and also Krishna Jatra. Okay, we find that in many cases the performer audience dynamics could not be in a way represented, or could not be recorded, okay, and documented, okay, in the way that the actual performance, okay, the actual ambience, the actual ecosystem of the folk performers and their audiences, okay, actually experienced. So this is something there is something which is untranslatable, okay, and that could be realized by any researcher, by any field researcher in the domain of indigenous cultural studies, that there are certain points where translation or where documentation is almost impossible. The first anthology now, just a quick look at the history of the Australian Aboriginal writings. So Catherine Langloh Parker's Australian Legendary Tales, the sanitized version of the myths. That English translation in alphabetic writing distorted the original form and function of the Aboriginal oral culture, the oral tradition, and the translation could merely recover. Okay, it was an attempt also. The translation was again a political act to recover the inner lost primitive of the Westerners. So there was something sensational and exotic. There was some kind of rediscovery of the lost primitive. So it was, in a way, a romantic engagement with the indigenous oral tradition for the sake of self gratification by the Western scholar and researcher, rather than a true representation of the indigenous tradition. And recent attempts include dialogue between Aboriginal speaker and the person recording the narratives. In fact, in the recent times, Australian researchers in the domain of Aboriginal studies have attempted to capture the essence of dialogue as far as practicable. So the person, the interviewer, and the interviewee are both recorded in a way where orthographies are also used to represent the words from Aboriginal languages and non-standard English pronunciations. So those attempts are also being made, and I think that in our own Indian situation, the projects, the translation projects, which attempt to translate indigenous literary texts from the bhasha literatures, from the local languages, from the regional languages, from the source languages, into say English or Hindi or any other world language, in a way should try to attempt to represent the words by using the orthographic method, and also by attempting to capture the non-standard English pronunciations. So that is part of what we should say a very sincere and also at the same time authentic attempt at making the experience of translation, the process of translation, complete. And if we look at the major works in the recent times by Australian Aboriginal authors, particularly the works which include the folkloric tradition, which includes the elements of orality, okay, and which represents the indigenous culture to perfection. Works like Paddy Rose Gulara Bulu and Mueke and Rose Reading the Country. And there are a few anthologies also now being published by Oxford Penguin and others. So it's all a very welcome move that the major global publishing houses have also taken active interest in publishing Australian Aboriginal literature. Now, let us look at the facets of endangerment as well in the context of Australian Aboriginal writing. The earliest Aboriginal writing by Bennelong in 1796, if we go through it, we find it's a record of torture, and Aboriginal people's contributions were not acknowledged. And there was a very oppressive school experience for the Aboriginal children since 1815. White people stole country and stole children, and the school imposed cultural assimilation, surveillance, and bodily discipline. In fact, the first Aboriginal newspaper, that is the Flinders Island Chronicle, was heavily censored by the white rulers, and to promote Christianity and civilization among the Aborigines. The proselytizing mission, all of us know that that also happened in the Indian subcontinent and in many other, erstwhile colonies of the British rulers. And English disrupted orally based Aboriginal gerontocracies, and English educated young Aborigines were more powerful than the older men, and the traditional protocols of communication were also ignored. So the political interest suffered, and what happened that the indigenous cultural communication system was largely ignored, and there was an attempt to decimate this cultural system. And human rights violation is a major concern. I have already mentioned it at the beginning of my presentation that the Aborigines' rights and freedoms were denied. Okay, women were separated from their children. Children were snatched away from their mothers. And Aborigines' letters were intercepted. They were read and destroyed by the reserve manager. But newspapers, letters, and written testimonies were the earliest specimens of indigenous literature that we find in Australia. And the 1st April 1938, we find the Abo Call was the first Aboriginal newsletter, which was about building national pan-Aboriginal political constituency, and it welded the local and regional Aboriginal groups into national, imagined community. There was an attempt to, unite the diverse, Aboriginal groups in different, Aboriginal locations throughout Australia. But even in the mid 1950s, we find that the Aboriginal writing was ignored, particularly in the high literary genres. And Devi Dunaipan, the first Aboriginal author, was assimilated by the whites. And he writes an autobiography which had been, thoroughly Christianized, My Life Story, published in 1951. In fact, if you look at the indigenous state of indigenous literature in the context of the Indian subcontinent, you would also find how the Dalit and tribal literature didn't find any independent voice, till the say early 1970s, till the formation of the Dalit Panthers, and the first major full-fledged human rights movement by the Dalit people. And also in the case of Bangla Dalit Sahitya movement, we find how the tragedy of Chuni Kotal, a Lodha Shabar tribal girl, in a way accentuated the whole movement, and how it inspired and guided the activists to form the Dalit Sahitya movement here. So, in a way, we find that there had been largely, an unconcern, and there had been a great apathy in the mainstream, literary circles about the need to recognize the minority voices, the marginal writings, and particularly the indigenous, oral culture, the indigenous identity, and the indigenous cultural traditions. So I refer to Jeru here because she was perhaps the most representative Australian Aboriginal poet, and particularly of the 20th century. And Ujeru, as a member of the Narikal people, was the Australian Aboriginal poet and activist, and she had a very checkered career, and she had an acute experience of pain and suffering, and that was expressed through literature, and that found a very moving poetical expression in her first anthology, We Are Going. And like any minor literature, Aboriginal literature of the 1960s and 1970s was part of their entry into the national politics. We know how even the Dalit solidarity, the tribal movements also were an attempt to gain entry into the national politics, as part of the general movement for recognition, and also an exercise in empowerment, and this solidarity was also an attempt to in a way unite, educate and agitate for the sake of empowerment of the marginalized communities. So Ujeru, Kevin Gilbert, Jack Davis, and Mudruru were founders of this contemporary trend. And I have used one quotation from Ujeru: "Let no one say the past is dead. The past is all about us and within." Okay, so there was harking back, a constant harking back to the past, to the glorious Aboriginal tradition, and to the rich oral culture, and the very important and a very significant and eco-friendly indigenous worldview, which was a glorious way out from the evils of the modern urban industrial society. And state repression continued, and we know that the Aboriginal demands were for justice, land rights, racist stereotyping, exclusionary models of national identity, correcting the biased historical narratives of progress and peaceful settlement. So, in a way, there was a continuous plea for the continuity of the past and present. Okay, so there were constant pleas for the pursuance of the policy of integration, so that the white and the black race could exist or survive together. Okay, so in a way, I have quoted a few lines from some of the very significant and relevant poems of Ujjeru with regard to identity crisis. You find this poem entitled "Assimilation." No, the poem clearly states the crisis in the Aboriginal identity, and how it becomes impossible for the Aboriginal people to accept the change, the inevitable change, and how it creates a huge conflict, or how it creates a huge crisis. So conflict and crisis. We must surrender now much that we love, the old freedoms for new musts, your world for ours. Do not ask of us to be deserters, to disown our mother, to change the unchangeable. The gum cannot be trained into an oak. So look at the final metaphor, and you can find that how it is impossible, to make the indigenous people white ideologically. And if you read Kim Scott's famous autobiographical novel, Benang, From the Heart, you would find that there was an impossible and ridiculous, pseudoscientific experimentation conducted by the white grandfather, great grandfather, uh, Ernest Solomon Cat, to dilute the strain. On the main objective of the pseudoscientific experiment was to dilute the strain, to dilute the color of the blood, color of the skin rather, to dilute the color of the skin, to make the black white. So if you continue the process of marrying an Aboriginal, say a boy or a girl, to a white man or a woman. No. So after 3 or 4 generations, the color of the skin will be white. There will be no traces of dark skin. So, such were the very absurd and ridiculous notions, racist notions of superiority, and how the compulsions of a hegemonic rule by the white Australians, okay, in a way encouraged such absurdist practices, and how it spelled great disaster, how it caused great pain and suffering for the Aboriginal people, for the Aboriginal children, particularly the new generation, the stolen generation. And look at the another poem. It's a very significant poem. It talks about the price of survival of the indigenous people. Integration, yes, eagerly we must learn to change, learn new needs we never wanted, new compulsions never needed, the price of survival. No, not assimilation, but integration, not submergence, but our uplifting. So black and white may go forward together. So we find how Ujeru appeals for this integration instead of assimilation. So let us now move on to the Indian situation, because it's a long story, and it would definitely take a lot of time to discuss all the effects of colonialism on the Australian, Aboriginal people, and the long history of their continual conflict with the, the colonialist forces, and how they had to preserve themselves, and how it was a story of survival, after paying a heavy price. And in fact, if we move on to the Indian situation, we find that here also the situation is not at all encouraging, rather very depressing. In fact, if we go by the UNESCO list, we find out of 6,000 languages in the world, 2,500 are already endangered. And India tops the list with 196 languages. And Rabha is found in West Bengal. The Rabha people are in North Bengal. Mundari people are in South Bengal. And you find here different gradations of endangerment, and definitely endangered Koch and Kuraru. Koch people are also there in North Bengal, um, and the severely endangered Paraji and Godava, critically endangered Birhod. Birhod are both in North and South Bengal, and they're already extinct 9 languages, and the one of them is already in North Bengal, one language, Tundu, that had died and that had become extinct. And I have used one Macher pot uh, created by the Potuas, the famous Potuas of Noya village, of Pingla Thana. You know that people who have visited Noya would come to know about this Macher pot, Matshonnay. I have used this to highlight the theme of killer languages, how the dominant languages, major languages, gobble up the minor languages, and how this cultural, in a way, killing continues. This assassination of minor cultures continues unabated, and it leads to the endangerment of the minor languages and cultures, and that is a global concern which we find in the Indian context as well. In fact, cultural amnesia is an inevitable phenomenon of the 21st century. The precarious position in the language politics of the 21st century. The minority languages are on the vanguard of a cultural amnesia ushered in by the majority languages. The Marga, the Sanskritized tradition, okay, and also the colonial tradition did not help in the development of the Bhasha, of the Bhashas. All of us know that. And particularly with regard to the denotified and nomadic tribes, okay, we find that their language and literature, had been ruthlessly derecognized, by the mainstream. And even today, we don't find the presence, say, of the writings of the denotified and nomadic tribe authors in any major way in the higher academic curriculum. We don't find it. In fact, exclusion of the oral communities, just like the Australian Aboriginal situation, uh, um, it does not find any mention in the Indian context as well. So, because they were beyond the Western cognitive categories, so monolingual texts were more important than the multilingual ones. And there was a vicious hierarchy as well in the Indian context because of that idea of a nation state. And there was the idea of a language, one language to preserve national unity. So it naturally put stress on the subnational languages. And these subnational or regional languages expect, once again, migration of smaller languages. So there is a vicious hierarchy as a result of the development. So, and all the regional languages once again feel very uneasy in the face of the mega languages, like English. That is an area of grave concern. In fact, the hierarchy of fear and anxiety can be perceived in all languages of the world. Even the continental varieties of the mega languages are very threatening. So, in the 21st century, we find a very rapid decline of the natural languages, particularly the unwritten languages, okay, the oral literature, the oral languages with oral traditions. And as you know, I think many of you are aware of this fact that how there had been silent death of many languages, many mother tongues. In 1961 census 1652, but in 1971 census it became 108. These are all tribal languages. The 109th slot was simply captioned as all others. So that was really a classic instance of derecognition and a summary rejection of the existence of a large number of indigenous languages. In fact, the small language communities, which exist mostly in the western, central, and eastern parts of the Indian subcontinent, are not mentioned, are not recognized in any way by the academic researchers and by the policymakers. So linguistic survey, census, and the facts, if we look there, since the colonial times, we find that there had been a tradition, okay, created by Sir George Abraham Grierson, to ignore in a way and to categorically state that some of the tribal languages are not used anymore. The people have lost their mother tongue. So languages like Khadiya, Malpahadiya, and also Kudmali, were in a way rejected by Grierson, as they had no existence. They are not in use anymore. So when you reject a language, when you derecognize a language, the entire literary tradition that is firmly embedded in that language, and the whole world of cultural practices, cultural conventions, and cultural rituals, traditions. Everything is, in a way, derecognized, or everything becomes extinct. So as if it doesn't exist. What happens that language, derecognizing a language, so killing a language, is actually killing, a very rich, oral tradition, killing a very rich culture, and killing a worldview, killing a unique worldview. So that is what happened. That is what happened in the case of, the indigenous, languages, particularly, the very minor, indigenous languages in the Australian Aboriginal context, as well as in the Indian, tribal context, in the Indian indigenous context. In fact, there are some, predictions which are quite alarming. If bhashas die at this rate, it is estimated that over the next 50 years, we will see the extinction of most of the bhashas spoken by the nomadic communities and Adivasis, just as we all witnessed a large scale erosion of some of the main bhashas that have a rich history of written literature. So, in a way, it happens. There is a continual, you know, downgrading of regional languages, and there is a constant threat to the bhashas, and particularly the languages of the tribal people. And I have been, pointing out the miserable plight of the literature of the DNT, uh, denotified tribes, and I mentioned some of them, available in English translation. Kishore Shantabai Kale's autobiography, Koletia Chepo, and Lakshman Mane's Upara, Atmaram Rathod's Tanda, and Lakshman Gaikwad's Uchalya. So they were all, in a way, writers from the nomadic communities. And if you look at the autobiographies, you would find how the how the behavior of society in general, how the attitude the of the larger society, the attitude of unconcern, of hatred, and of disgust, how everything, completely decimated self-respect of these people, the DNT people, and these, erstwhile criminal tribes, are almost invisible. They are, citizens of, no country, and they are invisible citizens of, say, many countries. How their existence is even unnoticed by the people, by the administration, by all others, okay, from the mainstream. Okay, so it's a very sad saga of the Indian, indigenous people, okay, their literature, their language, their culture. Okay, some translation, attempts have been made, and we have been able to document the literary writings, you know, in Bangla, the state language, and also in English translation during our SAP program that was conducted for a period of, more than a decade. So the one volume came up in 2017. It was published by Orient Black Swan. It was in Bangla, Paschim Banger Bhasha. If you find that book, you will come across the specimens of, oral literature, the songs, different cultural rituals, okay, of various indigenous communities in West Bengal. And as I have mentioned that they are okay, cross-border communities. They could also be found in Odisha, in Jharkhand, in Bihar, in Assam, in Tripura, in Bangladesh, in Sikkim, and Nepal, Bhutan. So, in a way, we have attempted to document the literature of at least 28 you know, uh, language communities of West Bengal. And apart from Bangla, Urdu, and Nepali, there are 25 languages, languages of different indigenous communities, which we have been able to document in separate chapters, in separate chapters in that book, Paschim Bangor Bhasha. And the English version of that book, the English edition, with some changes and also some additions, have also come up in 2019. In fact, the languages of West Bengal, the title of the book, the languages of West Bengal, and it was the result of the People's Linguistic Survey of India project, and our university departmental project was in a way part of this larger project. And if you look at the English volume, you will be able to understand how we have attempted to make a systematic documentation and analysis of the available literary specimens of various indigenous language communities of West Bengal. And more importantly, the entire survey, the entire project, the whole field work, and also the drafts of these chapters were prepared in collaboration with the language community member, one of the language community members, or more than one of them. So in a way, it had been a collaborative form of research where people from various indigenous communities have also, in a way, volunteered, have contributed to the making of the cultural profile of their respective communities. So it had also been an example of indigenous ethnographic attempt to represent one's own culture, to represent one's own literature, literary traditions, and to represent the language of one's own. So, with these few words, I stop sharing my presentation, and I uh, decide to conclude my talk here. Now, as I've already mentioned, it's a vast area. Could continue the discussion uh, for a number of lectures, as there are so many texts, so many translations, so many authors, and so many. So this discussion could continue, and I strongly believe that more research is required in this emerging area, and I hope that future researchers would also, pay attention to this area with the careful eye of a true comparative. Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you, sir, for shedding light on this topic. It's very important, and you are right. It cannot be. I mean, we cannot accommodate in one lecture of 1 or 2 hours. It's like a very vast area. And with this, sir, so should we move to the Q&A session because we have some questions coming up? We can quickly wrap our session with. If I'm just answering 2, 3 questions, maybe. Okay. Yes. First question we have is from Shuponna Mondu. She is one of our co-founder. Shuponna is asking, my question is, what is the difference between the approach of colonization and globalization in terms of addressing indigenous cultural identities?
Okay. Yes, that's a very good question. In fact, colonization and globalization should not be, in a way, viewed as two entire separate sets. In fact, globalization, in a way, is neo-colonization. It's a new avatar of colonization. In fact, globalization has definitely opened up various opportunities for any community, indigenous or non-indigenous, for the self-expression of any community throughout the world. Okay, but at the same time, as I it has created a conflict between tradition and modernity. Okay, and it has created certain unbridgeable spaces, eh, untranslatable cultural nuances, cultural codes, eh, which I think is impossible to assimilate, is impossible to by the new technology, by the new agents of representation. So, colonization has its own, history of appropriation, assimilation, and in a way exclusion of indigenous culture or identity. Globalization, on the other hand, okay, offers a promising exterior of creating an equal platform, a level playing ground for people of all cultures and of all identities. But in reality, it doesn't address, or rather it fails to address the specific cultural nuances of the marginalized culture or marginalized identity.
Thank you so much, sir. And for us viewers and participants, I would like to mention that sir is also the editor of Janojati Darpan. It's an amazing journal that is working for so many years on indigenous languages and literatures. Sir, should we take another question before ending the session?
স্যার
Yes.
আমি মানে একটা কথা অ্যাড করতে চাইছিলাম যে এখন
Yes,
যে
Anna, please go ahead.
মাল্টিকালচারালিজমের কথা বলা হয় বিভিন্ন ক্ষেত্রে তো
হ্যাঁ,
মানে সেটাকে অ্যাবরিজিনাল লিটারেচার মানে অ্যাবরিজিনাল বা ইন্ডিজিনাস আইডেন্টিটির দিক থেকে মানে কতটা ইনক্লুসিভ বলে মনে হয় আপনার?
মাল্টিকালচারাল।
হ্যাঁ, মাল্টিকালচারালিজমের কথা বলা হয় এখন বিভিন্ন
হুম
ক্ষেত্রে।
হুম
তো
হুম হুম
সেই পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে ইন্ডিজিনাস আইডেন্টিটি বা অ্যাবরিজিনাল আইডেন্টিটির কতটা মানে ইনক্লুসিভ হতে পেরেছে?
ইনক্লুসিভ হতে পারা বলতে মানে এখানেই আমি যেটা বলছিলাম যে এই যে একটা রিপ্রেজেন্টেশনাল পলিটিক্স যেটা সেইখানে কিন্তু পৌঁছতে গেলে মানে ইট ইজ আফটার অল হায়ারার্কি, মানে এখানে পৌঁছতে গেলেও সার্টেন লেভেল অফ প্রিপেয়ার্ডনেস ইজ রিকোয়ার্ড।
একদম।
এখন সেই প্রস্তুতিটার জন্য যেটা দরকার সেটা হচ্ছে যে যেমন নর্থ ইস্টে হয়েছে, মানে ডিউ টু ম্যাসিভ খ্রিস্টানাইজেশন এবং যেটা হয়েছে স্প্রেড অফ ইংলিশ এডুকেশন, ওখানে যেটা হয়েছে দেয়ার ইজ আ গ্রেট নাম্বার অফ রাইটার্স রাইট ইন ইংলিশ who can represent their cultural identity in English language. এই জায়গাটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট যে এই যে ইন ইংলিশ, লিটারেচার ইন ইংলিশ, এই জায়গাটা যে সমস্ত ইন্ডিজিনাস কালচারে তৈরি হয়ে গেছে তারা কিন্তু এই মাল্টিকালচারালিজমের যে অ্যাম্বিট, সেই অ্যাম্বিটের মধ্যে চলে এসেছে। কিন্তু যারা তাদের লিটারেচারকে রিপ্রেজেন্ট করতে পারেনি, যেমন আমি বললাম এই যে ডিনোটিফাইড লিটারেচার, লিটারেচার অফ দ্য ডিনোটিফাইড ট্রাইবস, এই ডিএনটি লিটারেচার দেখা যাবে হয়তো সর্বসাকুল্যে 4টি কি 5টি অটোবায়োগ্রাফি ট্রান্সলেটেড হয়েছে, কিন্তু মেজরিটি অফ দেয়ার লিটারারি প্রোডাক্টস, দেয়ার লিটারারি অ্যাটেম্পটস, সেইটা কিন্তু ট্রান্সলেটেড হয়নি। এখন যেগুলো ট্রান্সলেটেড হয়নি, এই কালচার গুলোকে কিন্তু মাল্টিকালচারালিজমের অ্যাম্বিটের মধ্যে এরা নেই, দে আর ইনভিজিবল। হ্যাঁ, দে আর এক্সক্লুডেড, কেননা দে ডোন্ট হ্যাভ এনি ভয়েস, দে ডোন্ট হ্যাভ এনি রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন। হ্যাঁ,
আচ্ছা।
কাজেই মানে অ্যাকচুয়ালি যেগুলো আনট্রান্সলেটেড ভাষা লিটারেচার, আনট্রান্সলেটেড এই ধরনের ইন্ডিজিনাস ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ লিটারেচার, হ্যাঁ, সেইগুলোকে কিন্তু আমরা কখনোই বলতে পারবো না যে দে আর পার্ট অফ দ্য মাল্টিকালচারাল ডিসকোর্স।
ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার, থ্যাংক ইউ।
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, should we take our last question or you want to wrap this session up?
Okay, we can take one more question.
Okay, sir. Yes, it's by Tariq Monwar. Is there any literary or cultural representations in West Bengal that we may cluster as Aboriginal literatures, other than Dalit and tribal literature?
No, actually,
Also, hmm,
Tariq, yes, I understand your question. Tariq, I think that there is a there is a problem in understanding I think the difference between aboriginality and indigeneity. I mentioned it at the beginning of my talk that
yes.
aboriginality is a term which had been used by the British, but it had not been accepted by the indigenous communities of Australia. Okay. They prefer the term indigenous to aboriginal. Okay. Because indigenous is in a way a neutral term. Okay. But aboriginal includes the stigma of what we should say, the colonial politics of nomenclature. Okay. As in the Indian context, once again, the difference between tribe and Adivasi. No, tribe is a typical, British anthropological concept. Okay. And the notion of a tribe, with its all anthropological, implications, okay, are in a way self-deprecatory for many indigenous communities. They don't accept the term tribe. If you look at the whole cultural politics, the colonialist politics of physical anthropology of a tribe, you would find that there a tribal person is reduced to the stature of a non-human. He is not regarded as a human. Okay, he is museumized. Okay, he is regarded as a
So,
museum piece. Okay, so that is demeaning. Okay, and that is detrimental to the self-respecting people. Okay. So Adivasi is now a more acceptable term because it is related to indigenous human rights. Okay, the notion of indigenous human rights movement, Adivasi, okay, that had also been popularized by the activism of Mahashweta Devi. Okay, all of us know that. So Adivasi, in a way, Adivasi literature is there in West Bengal. No, and it is not different from tribal literature. No, rather, it is just the other name of tribal literature. No, I think we should not, term it as Aboriginal literature, say in the context of India, okay, or maybe in the context of West Bengal, okay, not Aboriginal.
yes, he has elaborately placed his question here.
Mhm.
I think Sarah's covered that. We don't need to go further into that. Anyway, Tariq, thank you so much for your question. And before wrapping up, I just had one quick query. Like, about it's regarding to Australian Aboriginal oral tradition, the concept of dream time, the mythical world. They say Alchiring, I guess. I don't know the
Mhm.
exact pronunciation. So,
Anchi.
is it yes, sir. So this concept of Alchiringa, is it? I mean, reflected in the post-colonial literary scene? Is it like they have taken elements from in the written literatures? Like, is it there now?
Yes, yes. Particularly, it's found in the writings of Alexis Wright. If
Okay,
you
okay.
look at Alexis Wright's Carpentaria, you will find that she has followed this, mythical method, where she has actually used all these, ancient Aboriginal, cultural markers, okay, to show their contemporaneity in history. And there is a kind of that method to establish the presentness of the past.
Yes,
So
yes. The past is there with the
yes,
present.
yes,
Yes,
and that is
yes,
there. And that is
yes.
also, quite eminently illustrated in Ujeru's poem, We Are Going, where
Okay.
how the notion of dream time, that space time continuum, okay,
Yes,
is
yes,
deliberately desecrated by the white Australian government's policy of mining, gold mining,
yes,
and
yes, yes.
deliberate desecration of the sacred Aboriginal space. So as
And
if
I
to
think, yes,
decimate
sir.
their culture, their cultural identity.
Okay. And apparently, the first accepted text by the government was the Irkala, I think, the bark agreement.
Bark.
Yeah, yeah. It was
Ah, ah,
mining,
ah,
related to mining only. Yes,
ah, 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 ah.
yes, sir.
Thank
Thank you
you,
so
Arasrika,
much.
for pointing. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for shedding light on such an important topic. And this comparative study has been amazingly done by you. We look forward to more associations with you, sir. And on behalf of the team of Calcutta Comparatists 1919s and also our viewers and participants, I'd like to convey our hearty thanks to Professor Indranil Acharya for his excellent lecture. Thank you, sir, and a very good evening to you, and a very good evening to all our participants. And about our next lectures, we'll update it on our social media handles and also our websites. So stay tuned, friends. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so
Thank
much, sir, for joining us today. Thank you,
thank
sir.
you.